And because he did, it resulted in the saving even more, even though only 700 plus were saved, it was because of him, and he perished in the tragedy. I think one of the things that's so interesting about Titanic is as you continue to pull the threads, you'll see that everybody wants to point a finger, and maybe there's a questionable decision that turns into a story of heroism. Yes. But then you also have more than 40 countries represented in this one incident. So it is a global tragedy.
Looking for real stories of real people making a difference in the Grand Canyon State? Welcome to Finding Arizona podcast. We sit down with Arizona's inspiring entrepreneurs, creatives, and community leaders and give you a front row seat to their journeys, passions, and projects. Whether you're a local trying to find a hidden gem or just enjoy watching someone chase their dreams, Finding Arizona is your go-to place for authentic conversations with a desert twist. New episodes drop weekly, so hit subscribe and start exploring Arizona one story at a time. Welcome back, everybody, to the Finding Arizona podcast. I'm your host, Jose, and as always, we bring in fantastic guests every week. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to talk to you today. We're going to be talking about one of the most captivating and heartbreaking and endlessly fascinating stories in human history. Today, we're going to be speaking about the Titanic. And more than 110 years after the April night in 1912, the story of the RMS Titanic still stops people in their tracks today. Most of us know the ship hit an iceberg and sank, but here's what most people don't know. The real story is even more staggering than the Hollywood version. Because the Titanic's disaster wasn't just a tragedy, it was a masterclass in human error, ignored warnings, leadership failure, outdated regulations, and what happens when an entire industry normalizes risk until the unthinkable happens. And right now, here in Scottsdale, you have a chance to experience all of that firsthand. So Titanic, an immersive Voyage is a brand new experience opening July 3rd, timed to the anniversary of the historic British Titanic inquiry that uses virtual reality and cinematic storytelling to actually transport guests aboard the world's most famous ship and goes far beyond the movie and into the real decisions and the real warnings they were ignored, and the real safety failures that changed maritime history forever. Joining us today is Jessica Saunders, exhibit hub host of Titanic and Immersive Voyage, who is here to talk to us about the inside the experience and extraordinary lessons that are still shaping safety standards and more than a century years later. Jessica, welcome to Finding Arizona podcast. It's fantastic to have you for this conversation.
Oh, thank you, Jose. Thank you so much for having me, but then also for your expressed interest in this content. I mean,
Yes.
Titanic is just such a broad conversation, so let's go right in.
So one of the things that we were discussing was that this has been more than over a century of things going on with what has happened in the past. So why do you think in particular this disaster has never loosened its grip on the human imagination?
I think that there's just so many aspects to this one event in time. It's one night, but there was a series of events that led up to it, and then there's still discovery that continues to happen even in modern times. I think also it represented one of the first international tragedies. So beyond the fact that you have, the elite, the best of the best, the celebrities of the world on one deck of a ship, and then you've got people immigrating to America for the first time, going for the American dream, all in the same place. That was unprecedented. Yes. But then you also have more than 40 countries represented in this one incident. So it is a global tragedy. It's an international tragedy, and it's just has so many also philosophical and emotional components. You've got love, you've got loss, you've got tragedy, you've got, like we talked about in your intro, leadership decisions made in unprecedented times. So all of these themes continue to take this story into present day.
It's amazing that you find yourself in this kind of moment where you guys are celebrating something, or you're celebrating an anniversary of the inquiry. And one of the things that I just, particularly when it comes to meeting individuals like yourself, is I'm very curious about your own origin stories and how someone like yourself just really quickly ends up, partaking in something like this. Was this event ever a particular interest of yours growing up, or was there something about this career that has led you here that might give us a full circle moment?
Well, I'll tell you, I actually came into the content from the underwater archaeology side. I
Okay.
was really fascinated about discovery and our oceans being, an under-researched place, and the world that lies beneath the surface of the sea. And
Yes.
so when looking at Titanic, I was interested in what the wreck site tells us about our oceans, and
Hmm.
for many years, people thought that Titanic sank intact. They even though there were eyewitness testimonies that the ship broke in half, if you're a British shipmaker, you say, "Of course, my ship didn't break," and so it sank
Yes.
intact until it was discovered. And when it was discovered in two pieces, then it rewrote history. And then,
Yes.
fascinatingly enough, they found marine life existing at the wreck site and flourishing. And we didn't even know what a rusticle was, which is microorganisms that are eating the ship, and then what they excrete is the remains of the metals. So when you see modern day pictures of underwater Titanic and you see those kind of icicle looking things hanging
Yeah.
from the side, that's the excretion from microorganisms that are eating the metal. So that part of it was so fascinating to me. I
Yeah.
loved it. I grew up watching, Jacques Cousteau, and
Mhm.
then I got into. Well, wait a minute. What was the story? What's the backstory for this wreck site? And I will tell you, Jose, that like many people with this content, the more I learn, the more the story it just draws you in. You learn
Yeah.
one story, you learn another story, you think you've heard the most incredible story of sacrifice, and then you realize there's 2,000 more just
Mhm.
like it.
Yes.
So I never really dreamed about getting so much into the content, and yet for the last 20 years, I've spent my life around it. So
Yeah, it's
that's it.
such a ripple effect because I mean, it is affected on so many scales from the bigger industry to the individual stories. So I find that very fascinating too, because you take a tragedy, but you pull at it and the strings in a different scenarios. You can kind of find some silver linings, but you can also kind of see trajectories into safety protocols and all of that stuff as well. So before we get into that, but I want to kind of pull it back again to our listeners, and most of them who are listening grew up on the 1997 James Cameron film, The Titanic. And what does this particular immersive voyage reveal about the real story that the Hollywood never quite captured? And what will surprise people most when they step into this experience?
Well, I think that most people do come into the Titanic story through the movie now, currently, but
Yeah.
um, I think what's surprising and a big misconception about the story is that it was an iceberg that sank Titanic. And yes, the iceberg was the catalyst, 100%. However, there were a series of failures leading up to that created a perfect environment for the circumstances to combine in a perfectly wrong way for those passengers and crew.
Yeah.
So I think what's most surprising is when you learn that Titanic had enough lifeboats according to the regulations and the standards of its time,
Yeah.
but those regulations were based on tonnage and not passengers, and
Mm.
they topped out at 10,000 tons.
Yeah.
Titanic was 40,000. And so passenger ships continued to grow,
Yeah.
but the regulations weren't kept up. So it wasn't just one thing that sank Titanic. I think that's the thing that's most surprising in the misconception. And beyond the love story that draws us in, when I
Yes.
when I saw the movie, I was the things that I was expected to be upset by. I thought I was going to ugly cry behind Jack and Rose, um, and and uh, and I thought, okay, well, I already know how it ends. Literally, and I don't mean this as much of a pun, what we know about Titanic is the tip of the iceberg. When you come to the exhibition, you will definitely learn more about the real stories, the real passengers, and the things that you think are gonna be upsetting. It's not really so much the things that are. I found at the end of the story, the not going back for passengers, that were in the water was the most upsetting out of everything.
Yeah. Yeah. I
So I
can
think
I think from your experience, I can kind of really feel that, that kind of that decision really as a leader kind of affecting you deeply too? Because I can kind
Yes.
of, I definitely, I find that very much a real stain on the mark of like a lot of decision making. And I want to kind of pull up at this thread before we get too far down the rabbit hole. As far as the iceberg warnings, one of the most haunting details is that the inquiry is that there were multiple warnings were received before the collision. And so when you look at that leadership decisions on from a modern lens, what does it say about how organizations make choices when everything seems to be going well?
Well, I think one of the relevant lessons, we talk about how is Titanic relevant today, and what does it teach us, and what does it continue to teach us, and when you look at Titanic, you say uh, Titanic had the best and the latest technology on board. It had cutting edge, cutting edge technology. It was the internet or the cell phone of its time. Um, the warnings were received, but information is only as valuable as what you do with it. And I think that's also very relevant today. The warnings were received, but keep in mind that the people that were working the telegraph were employees of Marconi. Their job was to get messages out. They were doing their job. History judges us all, but in unprecedented circumstances, there's no playbook and you have a 50-50 chance in getting it right. They did what they thought that they were supposed to be doing with the information they had. Their job was to get first class passengers' messages out. So as these warnings were coming in, some made it to the bridge, some didn't, some were ignored,
Yeah,
some were taken seriously,
yeah.
but very much like real situations today, you just don't grasp the seriousness of the situation sometimes until it's too late.
Mhm. I think it's in particular, most people, like those who are fans of the movie. um I'm a very big movie lover myself, and so I like to go into the director's commentary, and I really like podcasting, so I'll listen to interviews with James Cameron. And one of the
Hmm.
things that I found out in particular was some of the scenes that he removed because he didn't feel like it was prevalent to the story that he was trying to tell, in particular to Titanic, the movie. But the what was the RMS, the other ship that was kind of signaling because they were coming the opposite direction and saw the ice and some of the issues, and they were signaling to the Titanic to the point where they basically were like, "Ignore it," it's like, "Stop messaging us," was,
Yeah, the
some of
Californian. Hmm.
yeah, so can you kinda attest to that and kinda give us a little background on that? Because I know it was it the California, or what
I
was
think it was
that?
Yeah, the Californian.
Yeah.
So they were messaging that they were stopped in an ice field, and what's amazing is that here you've got two telegraph operators that are working in a room, and again, they're employees of Marconi, and so they're supposed to be first class passengers. Are supposed to be sending these messages out. The Marconi telegraph was broken down earlier in the day, so they fixed it, but then they were behind. They had a stack of messages, so they're
Right.
tapping. And if you've ever watched, this is again, I the parts that fascinate me. If you've ever watched telegraph operators, go back and look at some of the historical
Yeah.
footage. Dots and dashes,
Mm.
dots and dashes,
Oh, yeah.
sending messages. I don't know if you remember when we used to have to send like text messages by
Mhm.
scrolling through
Oh, yeah, when you're doing
letters.
this with the your actual oh,
Can you
I remember
imagine?
when you had to hit
Can
it
you
4 times at the
imagine?
yes.
Oh, and don't miss a letter and have to go back. So
Yes,
so
yes.
dots and dashes, they are down there furiously dotting and dashing these messages out. And keep in mind, there's no multi-channel signals. So if you remember back in the days of call waiting where you're having a really great conversation and somebody's trying to buzz in. So they're sending these messages out and they keep getting interrupted. Oh, there's ice in the field. And they're like, yeah, we got it. Okay,
Yeah.
thank you. Let me stop what I'm doing. Got the message. The third one, the fourth one. And then finally, you have one of the operators that says, "Shut up. I am trying to work these messages." And so the Californian says, "Well, Titanic doesn't want to answer they don't care. They don't want to answer the phone.
Yeah,
I'm going to bed."
yeah.
So that when the same operator realized, "Oh my gosh, now we're in a crisis situation and I'm sending out SOSs and CQDs and trying to get help," the Californian is offline now because they went to bed. But that telegraph operator, the same one that said, "Shut up," stayed until the very end sending distress calls.
Oh,
And because he did, it resulted in the saving even more. Even though only 700 plus were saved, it was because of him, and he perished in the tragedy. So,
Wow. Yes, that's in a story. Again, I go back to like these what draws me a lot closer are the human experiences, and so that's something that I grew up around being Native American on my mother's side is that those human experiences, and you brought up the dashes and dots, you know, in particular, I come from a line, my tribe is Hopi and we are surrounded by the Navajo Nation. So in particular, the story of the Navajo talkers, and in particular for my own tribe, there were a couple of Hopi talkers that were in the military trying to help during the war. But the one thing that kind of I've done my research upon and looking back at that was the Morse code because it was a double code where the actual code, the language of the Navajo was the one code, but then you had to take it again. They were just speaking in sentences that didn't really make sense. The code was the sentence being broken again by military strategists, and then using that code to then put it into their own training and using that. But in particular, I just really remember doing the research and looking at the Morse code, like the actual like them really having to really try their best to concentrate and make sure those dashes and dots really came through and like were making sense to what they were trying to achieve. So, and those human experience really draw me in closer to that. And in particular, I would love to kind of understand how your experience here with in Scottsdale, the train, like how does the exhibition bring human elements to life?
well, first of all, that's fascinating. What you just
Thank
shared
you.
with me,
Oh, appreciate it. Thank
you
you.
see, I'm leaning in. I'm like, oh, I love it, and I also love, and you know, you asked about why is this story still relevant? And again, there's so many connection points that make this story somewhat personal. The goal of the exhibition, Titanic: An Immersive Voyage, is to make a connection point so people leave with a part of their story with them. It's to experience history. It's not to just look at it and witness history. It's to step inside of it and start to make these emotional connections. So we start with the building. Well, actually start with movies and media and the role that it plays in helping keep the story alive. Fun fact, because I just can't help myself. Dorothy Gibson was an actress that was on Titanic, and beyond James Cameron's film and the multiple films that have been made, the first silent film was produced with Dorothy Gibson. She survived the tragedy, and within I think it was within a month, her producers had her do a silent film about being rescued from Titanic, and she had to wear the dress and coat that she wore that she escaped that she survived
Yeah.
the sinking in,
Yeah.
and it was so traumatic for her. She had what we know now was PTSD, but the
Uh-huh.
very first film was within a month with Dorothy Gibson
Mm.
portraying the events where she was actually rescued wearing the same clothing. And that film has been lost to time. Nobody has a copy of it.
Oh my goodness.
It's really sad. But the exhibition goes through the media and the role of movies and film to keep the story alive and keep it relevant and keep people imagining and asking questions. And then from the building of the most luxurious liner of its time, the Ship of Dreams, all the way through this story, and then to discovery at the wreck site. So through immersive events and full scale reproductions of parts of the ship, and then at the end, the virtual reality allows people to explore the ship using immersive technology.
It's incredible. I mean, I find this story again from where you can start from and where you can end. There's so many places you can pull at, and the whole story in general is just extraordinary. So, one of the things I want to give to our audience is that the British inquiry was led by the Board of Trade and the same body that had previously approved the Titanic safety standards. How do you think about the conflict of interest, and what does it tell us about the accountability when the system investigating a failure is part of the system that
Well, I mean, I think that's another thing that's a little bit relevant today. Not
Yeah. Yeah.
being very careful
Yeah, yeah, of course, of course.
but I think that some of the best policy unfortunately comes out of tragedy. You think that you're making the best rules until something else happens. I
Yes.
mean, look at evacuation procedures out of Florida now. You know, we see people very much. You see a meteorologist sees a spiral in the bay, and they say, okay, it's time to evacuate. It's time to evacuate. And people look outside and see that it's sunny, and they say, no, I'm going to shelter in place. And so those rules have changed very much like the rules on Titanic have
Yes.
changed. Um, I think that there was an American commission that happened first, and that happened, as soon as Carpathia came to New York, and the Americans wanted to know what happened, who, and it wasn't a trial, it was a fact finding, but they
Yes.
were very concerned that the British were going to just sweep their people up and take them back before they had a chance to ask questions. So subpoenas and calls for testimony were waiting for survivors and officers when they got to the dock. So that lasted about 18 days, and then you get the British inquiry that lasts about 36 days,
Okay.
and that concluded on July 3rd. And the goal of the British inquiry was really to just dig into the events leading up to it. Now, again, history, we stand with the luxury of looking back. Hindsight is typically 2020.
Yes.
History judges people for decisions that were made, but the decisions were made with the best information they had at the
Of
time.
course.
Simple things like the number of lifeboats. The lifeboats were never intended as a life-saving measure. Because the sinking of the ship was inconceivable. They didn't say she was unsinkable. They said she was practically
Yes.
unsinkable.
Yes.
Okay. And so, worst case scenario in their minds at the time, because of hubris and because of vanity and man against nature and all of these wonderful things where we have an inflated version of ourselves, and we think we always think we have the best technology until we don't.
Yeah.
Um, the lifeboats were intended so that if the ship was incapacitated in any way, it could ferry passengers over to a rescue ship. Maybe the engine breaks down or one of the boilers, something happens. But a catastrophic failure just wasn't planned for. Why would you? It had never happened up until this point.
Yeah. That's
So they're
difficult.
investigating it. Yeah, so they're investigating themselves, but from a standpoint of the inconceivable.
Yeah, the the thought and the even like imagination just buckles at the thought of something like this happening. And so to even start an inquiry or like questioning like where do we even begin to start? And I find it also kind of fascinating that it was as they were being docked into the Americas, and it's like yeah, you see that scene where it's like they're getting questioned, but they're also going through um what was it getting passport checked and things like, but they're also inquiry like the Americans. And it also you could take it a step further. I mean, there were news reports, they had
Yeah.
interviews already coming out for once they docked, and it's very fascinating to get that first 24 to 48 hours after the incident, because there's so many reports and so many takes and so many eyewitness reports and all of that. So I find that so intriguing from the standpoints of like written history and written log.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
one of the things that we particularly focus on in our podcast is the modern day entrepreneurial hindsight, and we're kind of talking and walking around this legacy of modern safety. And so one of the things I'd love to kind of pull at is for our entrepreneurial audiences who who are building these teams, systems, organizations, whatever you were going to call it. What is the single most powerful leadership lesson the Titanic inquiry still has to teach us today?
Well, uh, um, I think it's very interesting that both the American Commission and the British inquiry arrived at the same conclusion. And and one very much wanted to point fingers, and the other one very much wanted to cover its bases. But they both arrived at the same conclusion that it wasn't a single factor that sank Titanic. It was a
Yes.
combination of things.
Yes.
So I think that that's very telling. I think it's also very interesting that even though the British inquiry very much it was in its interest to protect its reputation. Titanic was its pride in
Mm.
the world,
Yeah.
right? And this is something that played on an international stage and was quite embarrassing. I think that it's very important to note that the head of that inquiry, Lord Mercy, then went on to be the chairman of SOLAS, which was the safety of life at sea, which was responsible for putting a lot of the maritime rules and regulations in place that we have now.
Yes.
So you have it's I think one of the things that's so interesting about Titanic is as you continue to pull the threads, you'll see that everybody wants to point a finger, and maybe there's a questionable decision that turns into a story of heroism. There were so many failures here that then were turned into life-saving measures for future generations.
Yep.
So ICE Patrol is now overseen now by the U.S. Coast Guard, is
Nice.
in place because of the tragedy of Titanic. Okay,
Oh, that's wonderful.
rules about
Yeah.
rules about having telegraph or open line communications 24 hours because California went to sleep.
Mm.
Okay,
Yes.
that is because of Titanic. If you go on a cruise ship now and you do the life preparedness or emergency preparedness drills, that comes directly out of the fact that they were not done in Titanic. Okay. So, and making sure that in the regulation for lifeboats for every single passenger directly came out of the Titanic tragedy. So, so I think, when we look at leaderships, what's the single most theme here is that typically when bad things happen, it's never usually one cause and you say there's a catastrophic failure, but then you as a leader, what do you do? If you can't impact the tragedy that you had, what can you do to make sure that it never happens again?
Yeah. I'm incredibly this is something that I've been excited to even witness firsthand myself. I've seen pictures, but I'm very much in person kind of thing. So I would love, just as we're pivoting towards our final conversation questions, is just kind of what you've been told from the audience is some of the best kind of points that are a hit with people, that hit hardest with them. So maybe because you have this day-to-day operation in your line of sight, it was like, can you give us some real just key things that people you keep hearing from people that are wonderful takeaways?
I think again, people love Titanic and Immersive Voyage for a bunch of different reasons. I think that as storytellers, we understand that people internalize information in different ways. Some people like to look at things in cases and words on walls. Some people like to be in an environment and feel it around them and they want to experience it through media. Others like interactives. They like to press buttons to get information and really dig down into some of the details. And others certainly like to look at artifacts and things from authentic things from a historical period. The good news is that this exhibition has all of those things. So depending on what part works for you or what combination, you'll find it all within this exhibition. What I hear from guests, and it's very interesting because it's the Titanic experts are surprisingly sometimes children. I was in Phoenix, just this last week, and a woman brought her son, who was 8, and, he knew inside and out, just
Oh,
about everything. Boy, when I tell you
oh.
he gave me a run for my money, and when kids, they say, "Actually, mom," and they start
Yep,
fact correcting.
yep.
It's fantastic. I think guests are, so there's something for all ages as well, is my point.
That's incredible.
I think that obviously they're impacted by the tragedy and the loss of lives. When you get to the memorial gallery, there is a display that shows by class, first, second, and third, and crew, those saved and those lost. And it's tremendously impactful when you look at the difference between, just in numbers, of those who survived and those who were lost first class versus third class. The majority that were lost were third class and crew. And, it really causes an inflection point or a moment of the value of a human life that's just such an impactful visual. I think also sitting inside a full-scale reproduction of a lifeboat, while you're looking at scenes that are we'll never understand what those people went through. But being able to contextualize it, just makes it more impactful.
Mhm.
And then standing on the captain's bridge and um, watching all of those messages, those telegraph messages come up and knowing that the people on the bridge maybe didn't see all of them. So those are to me that, and then obviously standing in front of, an idea of the grand staircase is very impactful for scale.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, yeah, one of the things that I think people will definitely, I mean, you cannot connect without being immersed in like textile experiences where it's like when you brought up the lifeboats, I mean, I can only imagine again being able to like feel the wood, feel the
Yeah,
grain. That brings to light a lot of just full on, like, it's immersive. You cannot not be in that moment. So,
right.
um, thank you again for sharing, not only what you guys are bringing to Scottsdale, but just again, a little bit of your own personal experience.
Mhm.
And I find it thoroughly fascinating that you came to us with the love of just the biome that is the underwater there. And so
Yeah.
I really, when it comes to some of this stuff, I really love the minutia, like the little day-to-day stuff, but it's like also I just know that your day-to-day is probably jam-packed with a lot of sort of things. But what I'm picking at from you is like, I know that there's a lot of constant updating going down with the submersibles down there, constantly checking and kind of research. And what has been the latest with the RMS Titanic as of right now, or have you heard any news just coming from a research standpoint?
Well, I think, one of the things that the scientists are and oceanographers are looking at very closely is because of the microorganisms and because of the deterioration at the wreck site, one of these days, she's gonna collapse, and the decks they're already starting to see are starting to collapse upon each other, particularly, in the stern section, because that was the most damaged when it hit the ocean floor. So,
Hmm.
I think and there's a lot of speculation of, "Whoa, it's gonna be 10 years. Oh, it's gonna be 50 years, or it's gonna be 5 years." Nobody knows, and I think that's the part where very much again, sometime one day it will happen, and then everyone will know, and then that will set the policy for other shipwrecks,
Yeah,
in the world. So,
yeah.
I think that's what they're looking at, most closely, but I would be remiss if I don't make sure to mention where people can get tickets
Yes.
to
Oh,
be
that
able
was
to
going to
go
be
to
the
the
end. That was going to be
exhibition.
my final question. Don't you
Yeah.
worry. Yeah.
But on that note, Jose, I will
Yeah.
say that, at the exhibition, I mentioned the VR before. For my fascination being the wreck site, the VR allows people to explore the wreck site, and there's only a handful of people in this world who have ever been able to actually go in person. So this really is the opportunity for others, just the regular guest, the regular person, to be able to see what other people get to see, what a handful of people have got to see. So,
That's it. That's completely incredible. So now that you have brought it up, I will now conclude our conversation. Again, I really do appreciate your time just being with us and sharing a little bit of your own fascination. The experience overall, I know, is going to be really incredible. So for the families out there who are ready and chomping at the bit to experience this firsthand, please give them all the information of where they can find you online, how they can get involved, and where they can buy tickets. So go ahead, Jessica. The floor is yours.
absolutely. So Titanic: An Immersive Voyage is presented by Exhibition Hub, and it's at 4301 North Scottsdale Drive, and which is at the corner of 5th and North Scottsdale, and you're gonna take the escalators down. You can get tickets through the Fever website at expo-titanic.com, and you're gonna wanna get the VIP tickets because the VIP tickets include the VR experience.
Well, thank you, Jessica. I really do, again, want to say, from the standpoint of someone who is just a citizen, a fan, someone who's also just a little bit of a nerd about this stuff, I really do appreciate
Guilty.
you giving us your enjoyment, your insight, because I always feel as a customer, having a little bit of conversation, who's generally someone who is passionate as you are, makes me feel more open and inclined to just get involved and be
Do it,
just
yeah.
like, yeah, let's do this. And so just from this little bit of time I've had with you, I am so much more excited to bring my child and get involved and experience this firsthand. So thank you again for your time. Before we go, ladies and gentlemen, you can hear our episodes at findingarizonapodcast.com. Easy to find us social media wise, Finding Arizona Podcast under everything. But last but not least, we always end conversations with kisses, hugs, and belly rubs to our four-legged friends, and we will see you next time.